Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. We know we have several joining us, so welcome. Welcome to the 2022 Women in the Workplace Research Webinar. I am Wendy Doyle, President and CEO of United We. Let's start by further getting to know one another. And if you could drop your name, your organization, where you're joining us from into the chat, that would be great. So again, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have so many women and allies joining us for this important information. Today, we will look at the 2022 Women in the Workplace Research Report by McKinsey Company and released in partnership with LeanIn. If you have any questions during the presentation, please drop them into the chat and we will try to address them as we go. We will cover as many as we can at the end, but as mentioned, we'll try to meet you where you are throughout the presentation. For those of you who do not know, United We is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing all women's economic and civic leadership. Everything we do is rooted in data. We use evidence-based research to identify specific economic barriers to women across the nation and develop smart, practical solutions to overcome them. Our organization's strategic plan is actually based on the McKinsey data, which identified Kansas and Missouri economies stand to grow as much as 15% by 2025 if women's participation in the workplace is boosted. It is an honor to collaborate today with a partner who is deeply invested in research, just as we are. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Kweilin Ellingurd, who is joining us actually from Shanghai. So there's a little bit of a time difference. Kweilin is the Global Institute Director and Senior Partner at McKinsey Company. She has led numerous research efforts, including gender and racial equality, the future of work post-COVID, and more. Kweilin also leads McKinsey's global social responsibility investments in North America. Kweilin, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wendy, and wonderful to be with you all today. I wanted to do a couple of things with our time together today. One is to put gender equality in a broader global context and racial equality. And look around the world at where does the US stand compared to other countries. The second thing was to deep dive into our Women in the Workplace research results, which are hot off the press just a week or two ago released. And that is both by gender and race as well. And then the third thing was to explore solutions. What can companies do? What can each of us individuals do to accelerate gender and racial equality in the workplace? So with that, I'm going to jump into our first topic of putting this in a broader global perspective. But as we go, please do enter any questions, comments, reflections into the chat. And Wendy and I will together aim to monitor that as we go to try to address things more real time. And I will also try to save some time at the end as well for broader questions. Wonderful. Let's jump in. So we have done, McKinsey has done research around the world called Diversity Wins. We've done this research in 2015, in 2018, and in 2020. And what we did was look at thousands of companies around the world, in North America, South America, Asia, Africa, and we looked at the diversity of management teams. And we said, when the diversity of the management team is higher, how does that correlate with economic returns? How does that correlate with total returns to shareholders? And what we found every single time that we've done the research, and interestingly, every single time the relationship is stronger and stronger, is that when you control for industry, companies that are in the top quartile of gender diversity are 25% more likely to outperform their average in their industry. And when companies are in the top quartile of ethnic diversity, they're 36% more likely to outperform, actually the fourth quartile within their industry. So interestingly, ethnically diverse teams were even more likely to outperform financially than gender diverse teams. I wish we had the combination of both gender and ethnically diverse. Unfortunately, there was not a large enough data set for that combination. And some naysayers may say, well, that's correlation, it's not causation. but you can't put companies through a double-blind test. And so in a very competitive global set of industries and a very competitive market, correlation is pretty darn compelling. I also want to, if you flip to the next page, put this in a bit of context of companies. How are companies individually doing? And this data set is a set of companies, a few hundred companies in the US, plus a few hundred companies in the UK. And what you see on the left side is that very few companies actually improve significantly on gender diversity, and more companies improve on racial diversity or ethnic diversity, but also very few. So what you see on the x-axis is the baseline, right? Where did I start? If I started on the far right, I was starting with a more diverse company, gender-wise on the left, ethnically diverse wise on the right. On the y-axis, what you see in terms of how high you are there is what was the rate of improvement? How much did I improve off of my baseline? And unfortunately, what you see is that in the top right, companies that both started in a pretty good place and improved significantly, there's not very many of them. In fact, there's only about 5% of companies that are gender diverse and improving quite a bit. There's 15% of companies that are ethnically diverse to begin with and improving quite a bit. Unfortunately, you see about 50% of companies in the bottom left, kind of couple of quadrants there. So 50% of companies, half of all companies, are what I would call treading water, or in some cases making even negative progress, right? They're just trying to replace the diversity that they're losing. And so the question for all of us, and as you put your names and organizations in the chat, is how do we help our organizations be in that top half? And ideally even be in that top 5 to 15% of companies that are both starting in a good place and making significant progress. If you flip to the next page, the last kind of insight on global context that I'll share with you is what gender equality looks like across executive teams around the world. And if you look at the bright blue bar on this page, on this next page, that shows actually average female representation across executive leadership teams, right? So direct reports to the CEO. And what you see that, you know, in Norway and Australia and Sweden, about 24 to 28% of executive teams are women. In the United States, it's about 21%, 24, 25%, depending on how recently you cut the data. And if you continue to go kind of down the page further, you see France at 13%, Brazil, Germany, and Mexico at 8%, India at 5%, and Japan at 3%. So literally 3% of executive teams in Japanese companies are women. The overall average around the globe is about 15% of executive teams are women. The dark blue bar, or almost black bar there, though, is also very interesting. This is the percentage of companies that have at least one woman on the executive team. And so if you flip it around, the inverse is the percentage of companies that have entirely male leadership teams. So in the United States, 10% of companies have only men on their leadership team. If you go down a bit on Brazil, 60% of companies have entirely male leadership teams, and 83% in Japan. So as you look around the world, executive leadership teams across companies are still very much male dominated, and in many cases, entirely male. With that broader context around the world, let's jump into the second section, which is our Women in the Workplace research insights. And this year was our 8th year of this research. It is the broadest and deepest benchmarking of its kind, both by gender and race and other diversity elements as well that we'll talk through. About 333 companies participated this year, collectively representing over 12 million employees. And we did deep dive surveys with about 40,000 employees, and we'll talk through some of the insights from those surveys in a moment. And so let's flip ahead. Actually, if you just flip ahead 2 pages. What are the insights and what are the pain points in terms of both gender and racial diversity from women in the workplace? This was our 3rd year into COVID, so 2 years into the pandemic. If you flip forward to the next page, what we're seeing is 2 critical challenges. One that we've seen for a very long time is what we call the broken rung. And that is the gap or the lack of promotion at that first promotion to manager. And unfortunately, when women don't get promoted to that first promotion to manager, it's very difficult to catch up in the rest of the talent pipeline, right? We can, and we will today, talk about all of the levers that we can pull to make the pipeline less unequal. Actually, if you go back one page. But we can't actually equalize the rest of the pipeline when there's significant drop off at the early parts. The other challenge that we've seen this year, much more than any other year, is what we're calling the great breakup and a higher attrition rate overall. So let's dig into the numbers overall in this talent pipeline. If you look at the third row from the bottom, so end of 2021, this was the most recent data collected, just published 2 weeks ago. We start off on the left side at 48%. 48% of entry-level workers across all industries, this is a blended average of all industries, are women. 48% is pretty good, right? Almost 50-50, and that is encouraging. But keep in mind that 56% of college degrees today in the United States go to women. Women are the majority of valedictorians. Women have higher average GPAs. Women are the majority of master's degrees and PhDs. Women are outperforming men academically and have been for a while now in the United States. And frankly, that's true in pretty much every developed country around the world. And so if Fortune 500 companies, if this blended average of industries was getting their fair share of college educated talent, that 48% would be closer to 56%. So there's already some drop off at this entry level. Then between entry level to manager, there is an 8 percentage point drop off from 48% down to 40%, right? So now only 2 out of 5 managers are women. That's that broken rung that I was talking about, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Then at every single level, the representation of women drops by about 4 or so percentage points, pretty evenly, every single level to senior manager, to vice president, to senior vice president, and then to C-suite, so direct reports to the CEO. About 1 in 4 direct reports to a CEO are women. And as you look across the timeline over time, we've been doing this research now, this is the 8th year. If we look at where we've seen the most improvement, there is glacial, almost zero improvement at the entry level. Keep in mind, this is where 70% of employees sit, right? So as women at entry level are looking around, they're not seeing that many women progress to middle and more senior ranks. And they're not seeing very much improvement either. Where we have seen improvement is actually at the more senior levels. At the SVP level, at the C-suite level, we've seen 6 or 7 percentage points of improvement. And off the starting base, that's actually 20-25% lift. That's actually significant. That is where one different hiring decision can make a big difference, right? If I've got a 10-person leadership team and I hire 1 woman instead of 1 man, that's a 10% swing up here, 10% swing down there. It's a 20% difference with one different hiring decision. So that is the place where we've seen the greatest amount of improvement. I also want to point you to the dashed bright blue or light blue bar, women of color. And women of color in our research is Black, Latina, Asian, all kind of races together. And they start off at 19% of the entry level, exactly as men of color and roughly proportional to the broader population. Then they drop down dramatically to 5% of the C-suite. So 1 out of 20 people reporting to a CEO in the United States is either a Black, Latina, or Asian woman, all added together, plus all the other races. So women of color, this intersectionality, this greater challenge when you are both a woman and a woman of color is very evident here in these numbers. That's about a third of the level of men of color at 13% of the C-suite. Both are far, far too low, but the women of color, shockingly so. We also know that in technical roles, this would be technology, product, right? Other technical roles could be some of the sales element, some of the sales roles. Women are twice as likely to say that they are the only woman in the room, and only means that you're probably feeling a bit under a microscope. You don't feel like you have many others like you to share the experience with on your team or in your work environment. And we know that women onlys are a bit more both lonely at work, and they're more likely to want to leave in the medium to longer term. Melanie, yes, I do see your note. We will send a PDF of these materials after the conversation today. So that's the overall talent pipeline. And if you were to look at cross-industry numbers in a nutshell, this would be the page. So now let's dig into these insights in a little more depth. I'm going to dig into different parts of this talent pipeline in a little more detail. So if you flip to the next page, what we see is one of the two challenges that we talked about earlier, what we're calling the Great Breakup. Women in the United States are leaving their companies at the highest rate we've seen in years. In fact, for every one woman who is promoted, we're actually seeing 2 women leave. We cannot replace or promote the diversity fast enough to replace the women who are leaving the workplace. And as a baseline, women's 4-year average attrition coming into this year, right? So a little bit of the COVID effect, but kind of the 4-year average, women had a slightly higher attrition rate than men, but the jump during COVID was dramatic, right? So 26% increase in attrition this past year versus 17% for men, and that's off already an unequal base. In fact, if you look at US workforce numbers, we have recovered in terms of, well, almost recovered. In fact, the number of men in the workforce now is about equal to what it was 3 years ago, so pre-COVID. So men have fully recovered workforce-wise. Women, though, are about still 500,000 jobs short of where we were 3 years ago. And if you look at early COVID numbers, so that first September of COVID when schools were returning but largely remote, and there was a lot of remote and digital learning, about 1.1 million people were fired or left the workforce that September, and about 80% of them were women. In a work, 80% of them were women. The other gap that we see is around that broken rung. So if you flip to the next page, the other way to talk about that 48% dropping down to 40% at that first manager level, right, where we saw only 2 out of every 5 managers are women. Put in other numbers, for every 100 men who are promoted to manager, only 87 women are promoted. And unfortunately, only 82 women of color are promoted. And if you kind of aggregate that promotion gap, both over time and across companies, that's what we've got flowing through the end of the funnel. That was a slight improvement, a 1% promotion improvement from last year. Last year was 86 women for every 100 men. But the promotion for women of color was actually worse than before. And if you disaggregate women of color more deeply, only 75 Latinas are promoted for every 100 men, and it's even lower for Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous women. So most important or quite critical for us to focus on women of color. In fact, some companies think, if I can both fix this issue, both for women and women of color, if I can fix it for women of color, it will have solved the issue for women and men of color. And so really focusing on that intersectionality and the greater challenges we see across the pipeline there has been key for some companies. So as we step back, what is driving this great breakup that we talk about, right? This for every 1 promotion, there's 2 people, 2 women leaving. If you flip to the next page, there's actually 3 broad factors that we think are driving women's leaders' decision to leave. One is that women leaders want to advance just as much as their peers, but they're facing stronger headwinds than men. And we'll talk about what some of those are. But some of them are microaggressions. As an example, over a third of women leaders have had a coworker get credit for their idea. They are twice as likely to be mistaken for somebody much more junior. Over 2 out of 5 women leaders are burned out, consistently so. A second big driver is that women leaders are overworked both at work and at home and feeling under-recognized, right? So women are twice as likely to spend substantial time on diversity, equity, and inclusion, But many of them say it wasn't even acknowledged in my performance reviews nor rewarded. And at home as well, we'll talk a bit about the unequal balance of unpaid, what we call unpaid care work. The third theme is around women leaders really looking for a different work culture, right? Almost half of them say that flexibility is a top 3 consideration. Excuse me. And it would actually drive a job decision, right? To stay or join a new company. So a number of drivers that we think are right? If you flip to the next page, let's dig into some of this home and work balance a little bit more. So what we see here is women leaders are overworked at home. It's both unequal, and in fact, it gets even more unequal as women leaders get more and more senior. So at the entry level, 30% of men do all or most of the housework at home. 58% of women at the entry level do. That stays pretty consistent, no matter whether you're a first level manager, a senior manager, about 58, 52% of women do. But as men get more senior, they do fewer of them on average do most or all of the housework. So 13% of senior manager men do all or most of the housework compared to 52% of women. So basically, women at this senior manager level and above are 4 times as likely as their male peers to be doing all or most of the housework. About twice as likely overall. You simply can't be burning at both ends or frankly on all sides, right? It's challenging to balance everything at work and then do a disproportionate amount of work at home as well. We also wanted to look on the next page at younger women, and younger women here in this research being defined as women 30 years and below. And what you see here in the bright blue is that women really care about a number of these factors, and young women, frankly, even more so than women leaders on average. So 31% of women leaders really care about the opportunity to advance. I don't know what the other 2/3 were thinking, but 58% of women under 30 do, right? That is a critical factor for them. 76% of them really care about flexibility. And that has become even more important for 76% of them in the last couple of years. And so this kind of growing importance for women under 30, as well as a willingness to move, to change jobs or to join a company because of some of these factors is critical. I'll also highlight this last one, company commitment to well-being, has become more important for about 68% of women under 30. In the next couple pages, I want to dig into microaggressions. And microaggressions, there's a lot of different types of microaggressions, right? There's a small paper cuts at work that are annoying. Any given one of them is not going to change the course of your career, but they're painful. They shouldn't happen, and we should recognize and reduce how frequently these happen. And unfortunately, what we see is that they happen to women and women of color, women with disabilities or different abilities, more frequently than they happen to all women, and that they happen to all men. So microaggressions come in 2 flavors. One flavor is challenges to my competence. So other people get credit for my ideas, or my judgment is questioned in my area of expertise, or I'm mistaken for someone more junior. The other flavor of microaggression is what we call othering comments. People are making assumptions about my identity or nationality, or they comment on my appearance, or I'm criticized for my demeanor or my style or any range of things. And what we see is that women with different abilities are experiencing these microaggressions much more than women on average, and much, much more than men on average. LGBTQ plus women much more so than their female peers, and much more so than men, particularly on these othering comments and microaggressions. If you look at the bottom piece on psychological safety, who feels comfortable that they won't be penalized for their mistakes, or feel comfortable that they can disagree with their coworkers, or aren't feeling excluded. What we see is that both Black women and Latinas are feeling more of these psychological safety gaps than their female peers, and then in some cases men as well. On the next page, we flip that around and say, where are you feeling manager support, right? What we find in a lot of our research and insights is managers are the linchpin here. Managers can make diversity, equity, and inclusion a reality on your team and for your own experience, or they cannot, right? Sometimes it flows from the CEO on down, but even more important often than the CEO on your day-to-day experience is your team manager. And so in terms of manager support, showing interest in your career, checking in on well-being, promoting inclusion, Latinas and Black women are having a worse experience on those dimensions, and women of color are feeling less strong sponsorship. And what we've seen over not just this research, but other research is that women and people of color are often over-mentored, right? Lots of advice, but under-sponsored, right? When it comes to really risking your political capital, creating opportunities, making things happen, it happens less for women and women of color in particular, or people of color more broadly. And so how do we equalize some of these sponsorship gaps and some of the manager gaps that we've been seeing? On the next page, I think one of the unique elements of these last couple of years is this hybrid remote work, right? And all of us have been experiencing them, or many of us have been experiencing them much more. The interesting thing we found is that when you cut preferences by gender, perhaps not a huge surprise, more women want to work mostly remote, 61% compared to 50% of men. About the same want to split time evenly, and about almost half want to work mostly on site. Only 1 out of 10 women want to work mostly on site, 1 out of 5 men. Interestingly, if you cut this also by do you have children or not, more people, men and women with children, want to work more remotely. Also, if you cut this by seniority or sort of level or role in the organization, more senior leaders want to be more in the office and in person versus frontline workers, more junior workers typically tend to want to do that less. So now that we've seen that by gender, one of the reasons why that might be is because women actually experience fewer microaggressions when they're working remotely at least some of the time. And what you see on this next page is when women are working mostly on site, they have a higher percentage or likelihood to experience othering aggressions. When they work hybrid, a little bit less than that, and when they work mostly remotely in their own home, a bit less than that. Interestingly, when we cut this by LGBTQ+, women with different abilities, women of color, women with disabilities or different abilities were around 1.5 times as likely to experience microaggressions when they worked mostly on site. So a lot of different things driving these preferences, but that is a critical factor to think about.
Kweilin, we have received a question in the chat from Karen, and she's asking, would love to know if groups of men underrepresented as well as majority groups were asked about experiencing or agreeing with the same statements regarding microaggressions.
Yes, absolutely. If you want to flip back to a few pages, just that first page on microaggressions, what you have there, yes, is all men. I think we did split it. There weren't significant different trends there by, kind of all the subgroups of men, but we do have the men column there to begin with as a comparison point. And what you generally see across the board is, yes, men do experience these microaggressions, but not that frequently. Interestingly, 1 out of 5 feel like somebody else got credit for their idea. So maybe that's just an honest mistake, but it does happen almost twice as frequently for women of different abilities. 4% of them receive a comment on their appearance compared to about 3 times as much for LGBTQ+ women or women of different abilities. So it's more the difference here, twice as much for being criticized for their demeanor for, women of different abilities compared to all men, for instance. Wonderful. Yeah, let's flip to the next page and then maybe digging in a little bit deeper to this issue or the insight of managers are really the linchpin. And they're the linchpin for engagement, for happiness at work, likelihood, one of the most predictive elements of likelihood or wanting to be at your job for the medium to long term. And what we compare here in the bright blue ring is satisfaction of employees when managers are taking all key actions. In the middle ring, the black or the dark blue, when managers are not taking any of those actions. And you see dramatic difference, right? 55% of people are happy with their job when their managers aren't taking those actions, compared to 92% when they are. 92% would recommend their organization when their manager is taking all the key actions. 75% are unlikely to leave in the next year, compared to 37% if the managers are not taking the actions. And so managers really here being that linchpin of driving employee engagement, satisfaction, likelihood to be at the company in the medium and long term.
Kweilin, another question that popped into the chat, which is probably a question across the board of the data, is as individuals identify with more than one group, for example, women of color, disabilities, et cetera, would assume then the challenges increase. Was there an overlay of the data reviewed or identifying more than one group? And this was from Amy. So thank you for the question, Amy.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the same patterns of intersectionality being more challenging. So I'm both a woman and an Asian American. We would expect to see even greater kind of experience of microaggressions on average. We did not have the subcut of all of those intersectional groups at that level of granularity to be statistically significant, but that is broadly the pattern that we see. If you are both, we do some of the intersectionality with women of different abilities, right? You're both a woman and differently abled, LGBTQ plus women, so that already is explicitly in the data. And then the woman of color as well, that intersectionality is there. But if you are an Asian woman and LGBTQ plus, or an Asian woman and differently abled, I would expect, we don't have enough kind of data to show, I would expect those experiences of microaggressions and some of the challenges that we just highlighted to be even greater. Any other questions before we shift into the last and third section, which is what can companies do about it? What can each of us do about it? Okay. Great. Let's jump in then. And what we wanted to look at is we are starting to see pretty consistent and clear diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. There are a set of what we're calling table stakes. And these are things that about 3/4 of the companies are doing, right? If you're not doing them, it would be a good time to start now. You're probably behind the game. Then there are a set of leading policies, leading practices, and these are less common, but they're more common in companies that have higher representation of women and higher representation of women of color. So leading edge companies are doing this quite a bit. Then we see a bit of sort of bleeding edge companies, next horizon practices that are quite rare, right? They're adopted typically by less than 30% of the companies, but they are showing promise in terms of highly correlated with companies that are both starting in a good place and seeing significant improvement. So a range of different types of companies and practices. This next page is a bit busy, but I did want to be holistic about what we're seeing across these three categories, right? The table stakes, the leading policies, and the next horizon practices. And I think the most helpful thing to do here is kind of to take a look offline as I share this of, what does your company offer? And what you see in the black dot here is the percentage of non-top performing companies. Do they offer it or not? And then the blue dot is top performing companies. And so where you see a bigger gap might be where, it would be important to kind of look at those in particular and think about offering those. But there's broadly across employee benefits, things like personal time off for mental health, support for miscarriage, emergency backup childcare. There are elements and policies and support around career development, so formal sponsorship programs, providing opportunities to learn and develop, manager trainings, back to the manager as that linchpin that we were talking about, on promotion and equity, for instance, or training managers to help employees set boundaries. And then data tracking. Are you disaggregating the data? Are you setting quantitative targets and driving the accountability? A broad range here of leading companies that are doing these things versus kind of the non-top performing companies on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you flip to the next page, a kind of broader list of things that companies can do. And if I had to narrow it down to just two, it would be the first two on the list. Let me talk through the whole list, and then I'll dig into a couple of the ones I think are most important. Creating a culture of accountability, and I would say even more sharply, driving systematic accountability for DEI outcomes, not activities, not aspirations, outcomes. Equipping managers to meet the new bar. We've talked a lot about managers as that linchpin, and I think equipping them to raise challenging questions in people reviews and training them on unconscious bias, equipping them to handle well an awkward situation and conversation that needs to be addressed. Those are the kinds of skills that managers are going to need, and not just in person, but now increasingly in a remote and hybrid environment. And that is not a skill that most managers came into COVID with. A few other things that companies can do is disaggregate the data. So to the question raised earlier about intersectionality, right? Just understanding this data at this level of granularity is important. I would say, if possible, at an even greater level of granularity. So Asian and Asian Americans, that represents actually over half the world's population, right? To equate East Asian with South Asian, or even different countries and kind of number of years of immigrant status, et cetera, that is a large bucket, and it helps to disaggregate the data to understand what the trends and what the issues are. Another one is closing the gap between paper and practice. Oftentimes we'll have great policies on paper, so paternity leave, for example, but nobody takes the paternity leave, or it's deeply frowned upon. And when we align the incentives so that people role model taking the paternity leave, it's encouraged, in fact, in some cases expected, that's when we close the gap between paper and practice. I think there's a unique opportunity in this moment to redefine how work can be done. That could be better for women and men and kind of everybody. And how we return to work in a hybrid way, maintain productivity, but focus on what we call 5 C's, right? Communication, some types of communication, collaboration, celebration, those kinds of things, the things that are most important to be done in person and together, that can help us not necessarily need to spend all the time together, but make important time for the things that are most valuably done in person. And then, of course, with mental health increasing during the pandemic and being a critical factor before, supporting the whole employee. So those are actions that we've seen leading companies take that disproportionately drive diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes. If I had to whittle it down to 2, it would be accountability and equipping managers. Let me wrap up with actions that I think each of us can take in our daily lives that we can encourage others to take. And then I will open it up for a broader set of questions. So individually, what can we do? We can each mentor and sponsor, and I would say especially sponsor women, right? We saw earlier, women and people of color tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored. So who are the 3 people who you are going to sponsor who don't look like you? And who doesn't look like you is different than who doesn't look like me, but also encouraging our male colleagues and others to sponsor people who don't look like them. I think that's when we get the true value of diversity, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of teams. That's what we're really going for. The second thing would be giving women and people of color more tough and direct feedback. What we see in the data is that women and people of color do not receive that tough feedback as frequently as their peers. And we dig underneath and ask why. Managers, and these are both male and female managers, right, of mixed teams. So they're giving tough feedback to some people and not as much to others. And when we ask why, 2 broad themes come up. One is, I don't want to appear mean. And 2, I'm afraid of an emotional reaction. I'm afraid of tears. Whatever the reason they're not giving the tough feedback, if you compound that across a career, and I'm not getting the tough feedback I need of, Kweilin, here's what you need to do to learn how to run the business, then I'm not going to be able to grow as much. Instead, women continue to get more feedback on interpersonal style, and even in this day and age, on how we dress than men, right? And what we really need is the tough feedback and the feedback on how to run the business or how to advance in the role to grow as much. A few other things that individuals can do: we can celebrate each other and our accomplishments, right? To be that celebratory voice for a colleague. Rebalance in the small moments. So whether it's airtime in meetings, presenting at conferences, these small things matter and they do add up. When we see bias, especially if it's not happening to us, but we are in that conversation, interrupt it, address it in that moment, and make sure that women's ideas and voices are heard. But if I had to boil it down to two, it would be to sponsor women more systematically and people of color, and to give tough and direct feedback. With that, I'll open it up for any questions. Wendy, if you want to maybe share any of the themes that you're seeing.
Sure, absolutely. Kweilin, thank you so much for that informative overview. I know so many joining us today are, looking forward and have it on our calendars when the Women in the Workplace research report is getting released, and then we pass it between one another and look, just to inform ourselves. But this has been such a treat to be able to hear from you and actually walk through and give us a better idea of how we can use this research report. So thank you for that. So, at United We, our research, underscores undeniable the themes that you have, highlighted here, specifically barriers like unaffordable childcare, lack of paid family leave, and more, forcing women to leave their jobs. Your research also shows women leaders want a better culture, including more flexibility. We believe this is a huge factor in keeping women in the workplace. So at the beginning, in the introduction, I highlighted our strategic plan at United We is really based on a statistic from the McKinsey Global Institute of, if we really elevate and encourage women and boost participation in the labor force, we can grow our economies by as much as 15% by 2025. Based on this research report, does that statistic still hold true of growing the economy?
It does. And Wendy, unfortunately, it's probably even more. We have not updated that data, but because there are now more women out of the workforce than what we had kind of modeled as business as usual scenario, because we're now missing 500,000 more women in the workforce, the number is even greater, unfortunately. And Wendy, when women are out of the workforce, their unemployment is stickier. They stay out of the workforce for longer than men. And they also have a harder time getting back into the workforce. And so I'm concerned not just about this moment in time and exactly as you described, the GDP gap and opportunity, but also the lifetime earnings impact on the women when they do come back to the workforce.
Absolutely. And we know that women live longer than men, and not having that, building that financial support for long term really positions, aging women in a precarious position for sure. There is a question from Felician in the chat box, and she's just asking, I'd like to know how we may impact policy to meet some of the challenges identified, Kweilin, in the report.
Yeah. A couple things I'd love to see to help with this more systematically. One is childcare and family leave. And they're separate things, but very much intertwined. If you compare the United States to other countries around the world, it's embarrassing, our family leave policy. Childcare as well, right? The countries that were higher on that global list that I shared have very great sort of national childcare plans. We do not. We're moving in a better direction than before, but it's still a huge gap. And that is one of the biggest drivers of some of those gender gaps that we were talking about. So I would say childcare, family leave for sure. I do think that pay gaps could be quite helpful, right? In California, it's no longer legal to ask what your previous pay was because some of those pay gaps end up compounding over a career. Interestingly, for International Women's Day, there was a woman entrepreneur who created a chatbot that responded to every company that said, we're so happy to celebrate International Women's Day. She responded to the tweet automatically and put a link there that linked to their pay gap because in the UK, every company's gender pay gap is public. And that's, love the innovation, first of all. But that's the kind of thing when we make it public, the UK made a law, you have to disclose your gender pay gap. These things with transparency and a bit of sunshine tend to move in a better direction. So that would be kind of the second big theme policy-wise. And third, I think we have to be very conscious as we head back in a hybrid and more remote way than before. There are some advantages we talked through, right? Women's preferences, especially women with children and those preferences. But I think there are some yet truly understood gaps of if you're not in the workplace frequently, when there is an opportunity that comes up, are you going to be as top of mind? Are people going to systematically and subtly misinterpret your commitment to work because you're not in the office as much, right? So I can give you all exactly identical resumes, John Doe and Jane Doe. The exact font size, the font type, all the bullet points are the same. All I change is the name at the top. And men, and for me, the kicker is also women, will ascribe greater leadership and higher future potential to John Doe. These people don't even exist. We just made them up. But that is how we have socialized this concept of both leadership and potential. Now, if on that Jane Doe resume, I just change one thing, I put parent-teacher association leader or some other factor that she is an active parent, that woman is 87% less likely to get the job. That is the parent penalty, the motherhood penalty, not the parent penalty, the motherhood penalty that we all intuitively know, and I think is going to be a real issue if we have more of this hybrid remote, because it's subconsciously in many people's minds. And it's not just our male colleagues, it's also in women's kind of minds and sort of unconscious bias elements. And so I think we have to really understand what's that effect and how do we equalize the playing field when we have remote and hybrid work.
Thank you for those. And it's we align with some of your thinking here at United We, Kweilin. We are really focused on childcare and looking what we can do here in the mostly in the Midwest around from a policy perspective, looking at how we can overcome where we have significant challenges here. Also, paid family and medical leave is a significant priority. And we've just completed an exercise of just getting out and hearing from women around Missouri and Kansas and very much, top of mind. And pay equity certainly is important to really further economic development for women. A couple of additional questions jumping in the chat box. Keely shared wanting some definition about mentorship and sponsorship, and really can you further define sponsorship?
Yeah, maybe first mentorship. Mentorship is advice. It can be great advice, it can be very tailored advice, but it is advice at the end of the day. I could mentor a bunch of people. I could probably mentor dozens of people. I can only sponsor 2, 3, 4, maybe people. Sponsorship is about creating opportunities. Sponsorship is on a weekly basis. I think about how you're doing. I will bet and invest my personal and political capital to create opportunities for you, right? I'm truly invested. I make an opportunity happen that otherwise wouldn't have happened for you because I'm there to support you. That is a different level of commitment. And when you see groups of people, usually it's, one senior person, one middle person, and one more junior person, and they move up like that in lockstep, that is sponsorship in action, right? That's because of maybe relationships you had before, maybe relationships you forged at work, but that's the sponsorship that kind of moves people up in lockstep in tandem. And it's that sort of investment of personal political capital, the creation of opportunities, that is what is so short for women and people of color. We want more of that, and we want sponsorship on an equal basis.
Thank you for that. And several just comments in the chat box, including, really lending support to this great research report, Kweilin. Also, Patty's encouraging us to show up, and vote. That's one way that we can impact some policy. So thank you for that reminder as we have the upcoming midterm happening next week. And then also, I think we've got a question here, just kind of asking about several comments here. Let me find it, Kweilin. Leadership opportunities or positions. Are we, the data, only talking about leaders of people? It's a great question.
Yeah. In this case, it is, yes, leaders of people. I know some organizations have kind of individual contributors who can sort of move up and are typically promoted for more of their maybe technical expertise. But here in leadership roles, we mean you are leading at least one other person, typically a number of people or a team.
We have a question in the chat. So how should I talk with my company about changing its paid family leave policy? I'm a manager, but I do not have a director or a C-suite title. Currently, I have to use all of my PTO and vacation before getting some FMLA time, no more than 12 weeks of paid maternity leave.
That's a challenging one. Sometimes I've seen it brought up actually through employee resource groups. I've seen it brought up sometimes with other kind of corroborating data to say, you know, we looked at our offerings, but we also looked at a couple of other companies or competitors in our space, in our market, and here's what they're offering. We think it's important that we match that. You could have a conversation with HR. HR and kind of HR policy is typically where it starts. And if you feel comfortable, you could raise it there, or you could raise it under the umbrella of typically a woman or particular group's employee resource group as well. I think sometimes it's starting conversations like these, right? So maybe you or others are kind of presenting some of the data and insights to the broader leadership team and sort of raising it as part of a broader conversation of how do we equalize some of these gaps that we're seeing? But often it's starting the conversation, and usually it flows well from there. I would also say, interestingly, we increased our maternity leave pretty significantly. I will say it wasn't actually until we increased our paternity leave that it was much better for our women. Because when we increased pretty significantly our paternity leave, everybody got better at on-ramps and off-ramps. All of a sudden, nobody was thinking, you know, subconsciously, ooh, if I put that woman on the team, maybe she won't be able to kind of complete the project. I'll have to kind of transition. That will be very disruptive for our client. That could just as easily happen to a man. And in fact, it would be less visible. So you have no idea. So I think everybody got much better at, we're just going to have to figure out how to do this seamlessly, right? If you need to go for whatever reason, could be personal leave, could be health leave, could be any range of reasons. I'm going to have to figure out how to kind of seamlessly transition. And that helped all of us, I think. So not just maternity leave, but also paternity leave, and truly taking the paternity leave so that it is an actual real leave.
Kweilin, I love that strategy of really, you know, leading the conversation with paternity leave, then maternity, which then, you know, leads to the paid family and medical leave policy for the organization. That's a great strategy. Any other questions? I see there's, you know, lots of comments about, you know, maybe sharing this information in Rotary clubs and other, you know, on a smaller scale, which we love that idea. And we'd love to partner with you. So you can reach out to our United We team, Stephanie Morello, and she'll drop her contact information in the chat for you to, you know, support you with that information. Any other questions for Kweilin? You know, comments about the report? We certainly will have information, you know, a link actually to the McKinsey website, to the report on our United We website. We will also follow up. So many comments, you know, anxious to get their hands on the slides. We will follow up and send you those slides as well. And look, we have one additional question here for Kweilin. I think burnout culture is very real. And with women having more responsibility in general at home, it can be really challenging to quiet the voices or perception that moving up means my job will get more of my time, which is already hard to manage with health, mothering, career, and quiet space. What suggestions do you have to retain company cultures against burnout? Really great question.
Love it. Yeah. I've seen a few different things. Maybe first for the women, consider carefully both who you marry, but also the expectations that you set, not just early on, but frankly throughout, right? I think there's often a resetting of mutual expectations after having a child, if you choose to do so. And I think some people who might have started off on a more equal path might tend to get in a less equal path after kids. And so setting and resetting those expectations jointly, I think, is important. But to your question, what can companies do? I think a number of things. For example, you might not think of Bill Gates as a great gender equality proponent at this moment, but when he was earlier on in his career, he dropped his kids off at kind of daycare school twice a week. And it was role modeling that, you know what, if Bill Gates can do that, you can do that too. Mark Zuckerberg took a proper paternity leave, right? Back to the don't just put the policy on paper, actually do it. And he told everybody about it, right? He posted a photo of himself feeding his daughter and said, most important meeting of the day. Those are the types of role modeling, not just by a CEO, but often by a broader leadership team that tells us you can have a life, right? Not celebrating the workaholic culture. So when you come back from a vacation and somebody asks you, how was your break? We should not celebrate that, oh, I worked the entire time, right? Or on email all the time at all hours. But we've got pretty clear guidelines. For example, internally, we've got reminders that pop up even in our Outlook. If you can delay sending the email so that it is a normal time of working hours, please do so, right? These are clear reminders, nudges really, that happen. And I think they're important. So I would say both top-down leadership and role modeling wise, and then sort of nudges and kind of reminders to each of us. We know we shouldn't be either up at all hours or certainly sending email at all hours. But it takes that sort of nudge and reminder sometimes to do so. So I think I've seen some companies actually have a very explicit campaign for this. Like, how are we opening the aperture on leadership styles that we're going to celebrate and ones that are not kind of workaholic, that have a balanced family and life outside of work. So I'd suggest thinking about that if that is a critical issue.
Great.
And thank you all for your time today. And we will follow up with the materials. And if there are other questions that come up, please do let us know.
Kweilin, it's been our honor to have you with us today. Thank you for sharing this in-depth research report with us, giving us some behind the scenes, but also for your leadership and expertise. We were grateful to have you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.